September the 6th, 1976, 1,258 hours, 38,000 feet above the Sea of Japan. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Ivanovich Belenko felt the stick of his MiG-25 Foxbat tremble as he pushed the aircraft into a steep dive, breaking formation without warning. Below him, the gray waters of the Sea of Japan churned beneath scattered clouds. His radio exploded with urgent calls in Russian. Ground control at Sokol Air Base near Vladivostok was demanding he respond. His squadron commander, Major Konstantin Alexeyev, was ordering him to return to base immediately. The Soviet air defense network had detected his deviation. Fighter aircraft were being scrambled to intercept. Belenko reached down with a gloved hand and switched off the radio. The sudden silence in his cockpit was absolute except for the roar of twin Tumansky R-15B-300 engines consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate. His fuel gauge showed 18 minutes of flying time remaining at current consumption. 18 minutes to cover the 280 miles to Hakodate Airport in northern Japan. 18 minutes until he would either be free or dead. In the cockpit of the world's most feared interceptor, an aircraft Western intelligence believed could reach Mach 3.2 and engage any NATO bomber or reconnaissance aircraft with impunity, Belenko made his final calculations. He was defecting with one of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded military secrets. If caught, he would be executed. His wife would be sent to a psychiatric hospital or labor camp. His family would be destroyed. The KGB would erase his existence from all official records. What Soviet military intelligence didn't know, what the Communist Party leadership couldn't have imagined, was that this defection had been triggered not by recruitment or blackmail or ideology, but by something far simpler and more devastating. Viktor Belenko no longer believed anything his government told him. And that disbelief had started with something as mundane as a photograph of an American supermarket. The contradiction that would eventually drive Belenko across the Sea of Japan began 3 years earlier, in 1973, in a briefing room at the 513th Fighter Regiment's base at Chuguyevka, 140 miles north of Vladivostok. Captain Belenko, then a rising star in Soviet fighter aviation, sat through a standard political education session led by KGB Captain Nikolai Petrovich Makarov. These sessions were mandatory for all Soviet military personnel, designed to reinforce communist ideology and warn against Western propaganda. The topic that day was the deteriorating conditions in capitalist countries, particularly the United States. Captain Makarov displayed photographs meant to illustrate American poverty and social collapse. Images of homeless people in New York, unemployment lines in Detroit, urban decay in American cities. This was standard Soviet propaganda designed to reassure military officers that, despite shortages and hardships in the USSR, conditions in the capitalist West were far worse. But one photograph stopped Belenko cold. It showed what Captain Makarov described as a typical American slum neighborhood in Philadelphia, meant to demonstrate capitalist failure and worker exploitation. The KGB officer pointed to the rundown appearance of some buildings, the litter on one corner, the general urban decay. Belenko, however, was looking at something else entirely. In the background of this poverty photograph, clearly visible through a store window, were shelves. Shelves stocked with products in varieties and quantities he had never seen in any Soviet store, including the restricted shops available only to military officers and Communist Party members. Cans and boxes and packages in multiple colors and brands, stacked in casual abundance. More striking still, parked along this supposedly impoverished street, were 8 automobiles. 8 private automobiles in a single photograph of a slum neighborhood. In the Soviet Union, private car ownership was restricted to the elite. The waiting list for a Lada, the basic Soviet automobile, was 7 to 12 years. In a good Soviet neighborhood, you might see 2 or 3 cars belonging to party officials. This American slum had 8 visible in a single frame. Belenko raised his hand. The room went quiet. You didn't ask questions during political education sessions. You listened, agreed, and demonstrated proper socialist consciousness. Comrade Captain, Belenko said carefully, if these Americans are living in poverty, why do they have so many private automobiles? Captain Makarov's face hardened. These are not their automobiles, Captain Belenko. These belong to the factory owners and criminals who exploit these neighborhoods. The poor workers you see live in terrible conditions, while the rich drive these cars through their communities to mock them. The explanation was technically possible, but something about it didn't align with the visual evidence. If the cars belonged to wealthy people mocking the poor, why were they parked casually on the street rather than in guarded areas? Why were they standard sedans rather than luxury vehicles? Why did the photograph show such casual abundance in the background? After the briefing, Belenko's squadron mate, Captain Alexander Volkov, pulled him aside. "Victor, you ask dangerous questions. I understand curiosity, but such questions are noted in your file. Be more careful." Then Volkov added something in a voice barely above a whisper. "My uncle worked at the Soviet embassy in Paris for 2 years. When he returned, he was different. He told my father, his own brother, that the embassy staff shopped in French supermarkets with diplomatic privileges. He said what he saw in those stores made him question everything. He said this once, quietly, and never spoke of it again. Some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge." That night, Viktor Belenko couldn't sleep. He kept seeing that photograph, those cars, those store shelves. He began to notice other inconsistencies in Soviet propaganda about the West. News reports never showed ordinary Western life, only carefully selected images of protests, poverty, and problems. Soviet citizens who had any contact with foreigners faced immediate KGB investigation. Owning Western manufactured goods, even simple items like pens or clothing, attracted official suspicion. Most tellingly, the penalties for attempting to leave the Soviet Union were severe. The borders were heavily fortified not to keep enemies out, but to keep Soviet citizens in. If life in the West was truly as terrible as propaganda claimed, why did the state invest such enormous resources preventing people from seeing it for themselves? Viktor Ivanovich Belenko was born on February 15, 1947, in Nalchik, a city in the North Caucasus region of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. His father worked as a tractor driver on a collective farm. His mother worked in a textile factory. They were working-class Soviet citizens, exactly the people the communist system claimed to serve and elevate. Belenko's childhood was marked by the standard deprivations of Soviet life in the 1950s. The family lived in a two-room apartment shared with another family. They had no hot water, no telephone, and electricity that functioned inconsistently. Food was perpetually scarce. Meat appeared perhaps once a week. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only in late summer. Butter, sugar, and coffee required connections and luck to obtain. But this was normal. Everyone Belenko knew lived similarly. He had no comparison, no way to know that elsewhere in the world, ordinary working families lived with abundance that would seem fantastical to Soviet citizens. He was taught that Soviet workers, despite hardships, lived better than capitalist workers who faced exploitation, poverty, and oppression. Young Viktor showed aptitude for mathematics and sciences. His teachers recommended him for advanced education, and in 1965, at age 18, he was accepted into the Armavir Higher Military Aviation School. This was a prestigious opportunity, a path to becoming a Soviet Air Force pilot, one of the elite defenders of the motherland. The Armavir school provided Belenko's first glimpse of relative privilege within the Soviet system. Military cadets received better food than civilians, though still sparse by any objective measure. They had access to military stores with slightly better supplies. They were being trained to fly the most advanced aircraft in the Soviet inventory to defend Soviet airspace against NATO aggression. But the training also exposed Belenko to uncomfortable realities about Soviet technology and capabilities. The aircraft they trained on were poorly maintained. Parts were chronically unavailable. Equipment malfunctioned regularly, sometimes with fatal consequences. In 1968, Belenko witnessed a fellow cadet, Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailovich Fedorov, eject from a malfunctioning MiG-25. The ejection seat, manufactured in Soviet factories that proclaimed their technological superiority, failed to function properly. The parachute deployed incorrectly. Fedorov, 22 years old, died on impact. The official investigation blamed pilot error. The cadets knew better. They had all experienced the reality of Soviet equipment that looked impressive, but frequently failed. They wore flight suits that tore easily. They ate in mess halls where meat was rare. They flew aircraft that leaked hydraulic fluid and suffered chronic mechanical problems. Yet they were told constantly that they were the privileged elite of Soviet society, that they had it better than anyone else in the USSR, and that Soviet technology was superior to anything the decadent West could produce. If this was elite privilege, what did ordinary Soviet citizens endure? In 1971, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko received his dream assignment, the 513th Fighter Regiment at Chuguyevka Air Base, flying the MiG-25 Foxbat. This was the pinnacle of Soviet aviation, an interceptor that terrified NATO planners. Western intelligence believed the MiG-25 was a superfighter that could outfly anything America possessed. Belenko was joining the elite within the elite. The reality he discovered was more complex and more troubling. The MiG-25 was indeed fast, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2.8 and altitudes above 80,000 feet. But it achieved this through brute force rather than sophistication. The airframe was constructed primarily of nickel steel, not titanium or advanced alloys, making it extremely heavy. The engines were primitive by Western standards, essentially massive turbojets that consumed fuel at staggering rates and required major overhaul after only 150 hours of operation. Most revealing was the avionics. The MiG-25's electronics were based on vacuum tube technology. Vacuum tubes, the same technology American radios had used in the 1940s, technology the West had abandoned for transistors and integrated circuits decades earlier. Soviet engineers used vacuum tubes not because they were superior, but because Soviet semiconductor manufacturing was so primitive that reliable solid-state electronics couldn't be produced in quantity. The maintenance situation was even worse. Of the 513th Regiment's nominal complement of 40 MiG-25 aircraft, perhaps 25 were flyable at any given time. Parts were unavailable for months. Maintenance crews improvised repairs using whatever materials they could obtain. Engines that should have been replaced continued operation because replacements weren't available. The supposedly elite fighter regiment operated with barely 60% effectiveness. Belenko learned to read between the lines of official briefings. When Soviet intelligence officers said American pilots were reckless and poorly disciplined, he understood this meant American pilots were actually aggressive and well-trained. When they said American aircraft were fragile and unreliable, he knew this meant NATO aircraft were probably superior. The Soviet system, he was beginning to understand, consistently inverted truth in its communications. In 1973, Captain Belenko married Lyudmila Nikolaevna, a schoolteacher at the military school near Chuguyevka. As a married Soviet Air Force officer, Belenko received housing allocation. One room in a building shared with 4 other military families. One bathroom for all families. No hot water unless the central system was operating, which was perhaps 60% of the time. Heat was available during winter when the central heating worked, which was not always. This was considered good housing for a Soviet officer. Lyudmila earned 120 rubles per month as a teacher. Viktor earned 240 rubles as a fighter pilot. Their combined income of 360 rubles monthly placed them well above the Soviet average of 150 rubles. They were, by Soviet standards, relatively privileged. Yet they struggled constantly. The state stores had meat perhaps once a week, and lines formed immediately when it appeared. Fresh vegetables outside of late summer were virtually unknown. Coffee was rare. Sugar required ration coupons. When chocolate appeared, usually around holidays, people waited in lines for hours for small quantities. They owned no car. The waiting list for a lotto was 10 years, assuming one could demonstrate proper party connections and political reliability. Even bicycles required waiting lists and bureaucratic approvals. To travel beyond the local area, they needed internal passports and official permission. Viktor and Lyudmila owned one radio, Soviet-made, that worked intermittently. One small television, black and white, that received 2 channels. Basic furniture provided with their housing allocation. Minimal clothing, much of it worn and repaired multiple times. Kitchen implements adequate for basic cooking, no appliances beyond a hot plate. This was the life of privileged Soviet military elite, and they were told constantly that they lived better than anyone in the capitalist West, where workers faced exploitation and poverty. The incident that would crystallize Belenko's doubts occurred in June 1975 during a routine training mission. Four MiG-25 interceptors from the 513th Regiment were conducting patrol exercises along the Soviet coast near the Kuril Islands. Belenko was flying number 3 position when his radar briefly detected an aircraft flying at high altitude, approximately 75,000 feet, at the edge of Soviet airspace. The contact disappeared almost immediately, but Belenko had seen enough. The target was flying higher and faster than most aircraft could achieve, likely an American SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft. The SR-71 was legendary among Soviet pilots, an aircraft they couldn't catch, couldn't intercept, and could barely track. It flew routes along Soviet borders with impunity, photographing Soviet military installations while Soviet pilots watched helplessly. The existence of the SR-71 revealed something profound about the technological gap. The Americans had built an aircraft so advanced that the Soviet Union's best interceptors, including the vaunted MiG-25, couldn't effectively engage it. They had built this aircraft in the early 1960s, over a decade ago. If America had that kind of technology 13 years earlier, what did they have now that Soviet pilots hadn't even seen yet? After landing, Belenko asked his squadron commander, Major Pavel Mikhailovich Kuznetsov, about procedures for engaging SR-71 targets. The major's response was telling: "We track them, we report them, and we watch them fly away. Our orders are to attempt interception, but understand, Captain, that even at maximum performance, the MiG-25 cannot effectively engage the Blackbird. We might, with perfect positioning and luck, get close enough for a missile shot. The Americans know this. They fly their routes and watch us try to catch them, and they collect their intelligence while we burn fuel and accomplish nothing." The major paused, then added something in a lower voice. "Think about what that means, Victor. They built that aircraft before you graduated from flight school. They've been flying it over our territory for over a decade, and we still can't stop it. What does that tell you about the technology gap?" What it told Belenko was that the Soviet Union was not leading the world in aerospace technology as propaganda claimed. It was falling further behind, unable to match American capabilities, reduced to watching helplessly as American reconnaissance aircraft photographed Soviet military secrets with impunity. That same month, June 1975, another incident provided further evidence of systematic deception. A transport aircraft carrying supplies from Vladivostok to Chuguyevka crashed 30 miles from base due to engine failure. Belenko was part of the recovery and security team sent to secure the crash site and salvage sensitive materials. Among the cargo were supplies destined for the officers' store at Chuguyevka, the restricted shop where military officers could purchase goods unavailable to ordinary Soviet citizens. The crash had scattered these packages across the countryside, revealing contents that were supposed to remain hidden from ordinary soldiers and civilians. Cases of imported coffee from Vietnam, chocolate from East Germany, canned meat from Bulgaria, condensed milk from Poland, tobacco from Cuba, even some items from Finland that had somehow entered Soviet distribution. These were luxuries that ordinary Soviet citizens saw rarely if ever, yet they were routine supplies for officers. But one container had broken open to reveal something more explosive: Western magazines. English and German language magazines with covers torn off, clearly intelligence materials or materials confiscated from foreigners. Several pages had fallen out, scattered in the mud. Belenko picked them up before they could be secured by the KGB political officer supervising the recovery. What he saw shook his understanding of reality. The pages included advertisements from American and Western European magazines. Advertisements for consumer products, automobiles, household appliances, food items, electronics, clothing. The casual abundance displayed in these advertisements exceeded anything Belenko had ever seen or imagined. One advertisement showed a kitchen, an American family kitchen in what appeared to be an ordinary home. The refrigerator visible in the photograph was larger than many Soviet apartments. The countertops displayed more food than a Soviet family would see in a month. The appliances, multiple specialized devices for cooking and food preparation, represented technology Belenko didn't even know existed for home use. Another page showed an automobile advertisement. The car, a standard American sedan, was shown in a suburban driveway alongside two other cars. The advertisement text mentioned that this was an affordable family vehicle. Three cars in one family's driveway treated as normal in an advertisement for ordinary consumers. The KGB political officer, Captain Sergei Ivanovich Volkov, noticed Belenko examining the pages. He walked over quickly and took them from Belenko's hands. Propaganda, Captain. The Americans produce these to make their system look successful. It's all fabrication, lies designed to make capitalism appear viable when in reality American workers live in desperate poverty. Don't be deceived by capitalist advertising techniques. But Belenko had noticed something the political officer perhaps missed or chose to ignore. These weren't propaganda materials in the traditional sense. They were commercial advertisements designed not to impress foreigners, but to sell products to Americans. Why would American companies spend money creating elaborate false advertisements, showing abundance that didn't exist, for the purpose of selling products to American consumers? The logic only worked if the products were real and the abundance was real. If these advertisements were shown to Americans, and Americans had money to purchase these products, then the abundance depicted must be at least partially genuine. The alternative? That American companies created massive fraudulent advertising campaigns for products that didn't exist or couldn't be purchased, made no economic sense. That evening, Belenko sat in the small room he shared with his wife and thought through the implications. The Soviet government had told him his entire life that capitalism was failing, that American workers lived in poverty, that Soviet socialism represented humanity's future while capitalism was dying. Yet the evidence kept contradicting these claims. The photographs meant to show American poverty showed casual car ownership. The magazines confiscated as propaganda showed abundance beyond imagination. Soviet pilots couldn't catch American reconnaissance aircraft that were over a decade old. Soviet factories couldn't produce the consumer goods that appeared routinely in Western advertisements. What if everything he'd been told was not just exaggerated but inverted? What if the Soviet Union wasn't leading the world but falling catastrophically behind? What if the hardships and shortages Soviet citizens endured weren't necessary sacrifices for a glorious future, but symptoms of a failing system? These questions, once formed, couldn't be unasked, and they were dangerous beyond measure. In the Soviet Union, questioning the fundamental legitimacy of the Communist Party and its narrative was treated not as political dissent, but as mental illness. Citizens who persistently questioned official truth were diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia and sent to psychiatric hospitals where they were forcibly medicated until they either accepted official reality or became genuinely mentally ill from the treatment. Belenko said nothing to his wife, nothing to his fellow officers, nothing to anyone. But he began to pay closer attention to contradictions and inconsistencies. He began to keep a mental catalog of things that didn't align with official narratives. And he began to think about the unthinkable: defection. The planning would take more than a year. Defection by Soviet military officers was rare and extraordinarily difficult. The KGB maintained extensive surveillance on all military personnel, particularly pilots, who had both the means and motive to flee. Pilots were never allowed to fly solo near borders without extensive security protocols. Flight routes were monitored constantly. Deviation from assigned paths triggered immediate alert and response. Moreover, the consequences for failure were absolute. Successful defectors might gain freedom, but they condemned their families to punishment. Wives and children of defectors were arrested, interrogated, sent to labor camps or psychiatric hospitals. Parents and siblings lost their jobs, housing, and social position. The Soviet state enacted comprehensive vengeance on defectors' families as both punishment and deterrent. Could Belenko condemn Ludmila to that fate? His mother? His younger sister? Was the truth about the West, whatever it might be, worth destroying everyone he loved? These questions haunted him through 1975 and into 1976. He grew emotionally distant from his wife, not because he loved her less, but because he was preparing himself for what he might do. He studied maps of Japan, memorizing the location of Hakodate Airport on the northern island of Hokkaido. He calculated fuel requirements and ranges. He watched weather patterns, noting when cloud cover over the Sea of Japan would provide concealment from visual detection. Most difficult was the moral dimension. He was not fleeing persecution. He was not escaping arrest. He was a privileged Soviet officer with a good career, comfortable by Soviet standards. Defection would make him a traitor in Soviet eyes, a criminal who stole military property and betrayed his oath. But Belenko had reached a conclusion that made these considerations secondary. His government had lied to him systematically about everything, his entire life. The system he was defending was built on lies so comprehensive that questioning them was treated as insanity. He needed to know the truth, even if the price was everything and everyone he had known. On September 6, 1976, conditions aligned. Weather forecasts showed scattered clouds over the Sea of Japan. Belenko's squadron was scheduled for routine patrol exercises along the Soviet coast, flights that would take them within 200 miles of Japan. The mission profile would include standard maneuvers where aircraft temporarily separated from formation. At 11:30 hours, 4 MiG-25 interceptors from the 513th Fighter Regiment took off from Chuguyevka Air Base. The formation commander was Major Kuznetsov. Belenko flew as number 3 aircraft. The mission plan called for a patrol along the coast, then return to base. Total flight time, approximately 90 minutes. The formation flew north along the coast at 38,000 feet, maintaining standard patrol pattern. Belenko performed all required radio checks, responded to all communications, flew perfect formation. Everything appeared routine. At 12:47 hours, the formation entered a cloud bank while executing a standard turn. This was the moment. Belenko broke formation, pushed his throttles to maximum power, and dove toward the sea. He descended to less than 500 feet above the water, below effective radar coverage, and turned southeast toward Japan. The response was immediate. Within 3 minutes, ground control was calling his aircraft frantically. The squadron commander was ordering him to respond. The Soviet Air Defense Network reported a possible defector heading southeast. Fighter aircraft were being scrambled from multiple bases to intercept. Surface-to-air missile batteries along the coast were placed on alert. But Belenko had a critical head start. By the time Soviet fighters could reach his last known position, he would be in Japanese airspace. The MiG-25, for all its flaws, was still the fastest operational fighter aircraft in the world. At maximum speed and low altitude, he was nearly uncatchable. The fuel situation was critical. The MiG-25's massive engines consumed fuel at catastrophic rates, especially at low altitude and maximum power. Belenko calculated he had perhaps 25 minutes of fuel remaining, maybe 30 if he was lucky. The distance to Hakodate was approximately 280 miles. He would arrive with virtually empty tanks. The Sea of Japan passed below in a gray-green blur. His altitude warning system screamed continuously, protesting flight so close to the waves. The stick shook with turbulence. Every minute brought him closer to either freedom or a water landing that would certainly be fatal. At 13:09 hours, the coast of Hokkaido appeared ahead. Belenko pulled up to 5,000 feet and looked for Hakodate Airport. His fuel gauge showed less than 5 minutes of flying time remaining. The engines were consuming the last reserves. There. The airport, a civilian facility with a single main runway, appeared to the south. Belenko turned toward it, simultaneously trying to recall the English phrases he had practiced. His English was minimal, barely functional, learned from forbidden language books he had studied secretly over the past year. He lowered his landing gear. The MiG-25's approach speed was far too high for safe landing on a civilian runway. He deployed speed brakes and began a steep descent, shedding altitude and speed as rapidly as possible. The airport tower was certainly seeing him now, certainly confused or alarmed by the sight of a Soviet military aircraft approaching at high speed. At 13:16 hours, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Ivanovich Belenko landed his MiG-25 Foxbat on runway 30 at Hakodate Airport. The landing was rough, fast, and dangerous. He braked hard, tires smoking, engines dying as the last fuel was consumed. The aircraft rolled approximately 4,000 feet before stopping. Belenko shut down all systems, unstrapped himself, and opened the canopy. Japanese airport vehicles were approaching, sirens wailing. Ground personnel stood frozen, uncertain what was happening. A few passengers and workers watched from the terminal, equally confused. Belenko climbed down from the cockpit carefully, his legs shaking from adrenaline and tension. He had practiced his English phrase hundreds of times in his mind. As Japanese airport security vehicles surrounded him, he raised his hands and spoke in heavily accented English. "I am Soviet pilot. I request political asylum. American Embassy? I not return Soviet Union. Please, American Embassy." The Japanese security personnel looked at each other, clearly uncertain how to proceed. One spoke some English and repeated Belenko's request into a radio. Within minutes, Japanese police arrived. Within hours, American intelligence officers were being notified. Within 2 days, the most significant Soviet military defection of the Cold War would begin to unfold. The initial hours were confusing for everyone involved. Japanese authorities had no protocol for Soviet fighter pilots requesting asylum. The diplomatic implications were enormous. The Soviet Union was demanding immediate return of both pilot and aircraft. Japan's relationship with the USSR was tense. American intelligence desperately wanted access to both the pilot and the MiG-25, which represented intelligence worth billions of dollars. Belenko was taken to a room at Hakodate Airport while Japanese officials contacted Tokyo and began frantic diplomatic consultations. He was not arrested exactly, but also not free. Japanese police provided security while government officials decided what to do. Then someone, a Japanese police officer acting on simple human compassion, asked through a translator if Belenko was hungry. He was. He hadn't eaten since breakfast at Chuguyevka Air Base, and the stress of defection had left him exhausted. The police officer ordered food from a local restaurant. What arrived was a standard Japanese bento box, an ordinary lunch by Japanese standards, nothing special or unusual. To Viktor Belenko, it represented an introduction to abundance he had never imagined. The bento box contained white rice, pure and clean, not the mixture of grains and fillers common in Soviet cafeterias. Grilled fish, fresh and well prepared. Pickled vegetables of varieties he couldn't identify. A small piece of tamagoyaki, sweet egg omelet. Fresh fruit, including an orange slice. Miso soup, green tea. The portion size exceeded what Belenko typically ate for dinner in the Soviet Union. The quality of ingredients was far superior to anything available in regular Soviet stores. The presentation showed care and attention that Soviet institutional food never possessed. Belenko later testified that he sat staring at this lunch for several minutes before eating it. His mind was trying to process what it meant. This was Japan, which Soviet propaganda described as a capitalist country where workers faced exploitation and most people lived in difficult conditions. Yet apparently even a police station in a small city could casually order such food from a local restaurant, and it was considered normal, ordinary, nothing special. The police officer, noticing Belenko's hesitation, asked through the translator if the food was acceptable. Would he like something else? Tea? Coffee? Something different? Belenko ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to make the meal last. When he finished, he asked the translator to thank the officer for the meal. Then he asked how much such food cost. The translator consulted with the officer, then answered, "He says maybe 500 to 600 yen, perhaps equivalent to what an ordinary worker earns in about an hour of work." Belenko did mental calculations. In Soviet terms, this meal represented food quality and quantity that would cost perhaps 10 rubles, if somehow available, nearly half a day's wages for an average Soviet worker. Yet in Japan, it was a casual meal that could be obtained for an hour's pay. Over the next 3 days, while Japanese and American diplomats negotiated and Soviet officials demanded Belenko's return, He was housed in a hotel room in Hakodate under security guard. The hotel, by Japanese standards, was middle range, decent but nothing luxurious, the sort of place business travelers might stay. To Viktor Belenko, it represented wealth beyond his previous imagination. The room had electricity that never failed, available 24 hours daily, hot and cold running water at all times, instantly available, a private bathroom with flush toilet and shower, a television with multiple channels broadcasting in color, a telephone heating that worked consistently and could be adjusted, furniture that was solid, clean, and well made, clean linens changed daily. The American CIA officers who began arriving to negotiate Belenko's defection noted in their reports that he spent considerable time simply turning the hot water faucet on and off, apparently fascinated by the concept of unlimited hot water available instantly at any hour. In the Soviet Union, hot water was available perhaps a few hours daily in buildings equipped with central systems, and many buildings had no hot water at all. The television mesmerized him. Japanese television broadcast in full color, a technology Soviet television was only beginning to implement in limited areas of major cities. But more shocking than the technology was the content. Commercial advertisements, dozens of them, hundreds during a single evening, showing products available for purchase. Automobiles, electronics, food, clothing, household goods, appliances. Advertisement after advertisement showcasing abundance, assuming viewers had money and ability to purchase these items. Belenko understood that advertisements exaggerate and present products in the best possible light. But the sheer variety, the casual assumption that ordinary Japanese people could and would purchase these items, contradicted everything he had been taught. If these were all lies, why would Japanese companies spend enormous sums on such elaborate falsehoods? The advertisements made economic sense only if the products were real, available, and purchasable by ordinary consumers. On September 9th, Japanese authorities agreed to transfer Belenko to American custody. The diplomatic solution was elegant. Japan would return the MiG-25 to the Soviet Union, after American intelligence had thoroughly examined it, but would honor Belenko's asylum request by transferring him to the United States. The Soviet government protested vigorously but had little recourse beyond diplomatic complaints. A U.S. Air Force C-141 Starlifter transport aircraft flew Belenko from Japan to a military base in Alaska, then to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. These flights, routine military transports by American standards, provided Belenko with further education in the gap between Soviet propaganda and Western reality. The C-141 crew treated him courteously, even kindly. They offered him food, not special rations for a defector, simply the standard in-flight meals that U.S. military personnel received. Sandwiches with real meat, fruit, cookies, coffee, soda, juice. The quantity and quality exceeded what Soviet Air Force officers received as privileged rations. One crew member, a sergeant, noticed Belenko's apparent amazement at the food and tried to apologize through the translator. "Sorry, the food's not better, just standard Air Force stuff. Nothing special. When we get to Andrews, we'll make sure you get a real meal." Belenko tried to explain through the translator that this food was better than what Soviet fighter pilots received as elite rations. The sergeant seemed confused, unable to comprehend how what Americans considered standard or even substandard military food could be considered excellent by Soviet standards. The C-141's interior represented another revelation. The cargo aircraft was well maintained, clean, functional. The crew was professional but relaxed, none of the rigid formality of Soviet military culture. The equipment worked. The systems functioned reliably. Everything suggested an organization with adequate resources and training. When the transport landed at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C., Belenko's formal debriefing process began. The Central Intelligence Agency had been preparing for this moment, recognizing that Belenko represented extraordinary intelligence value, both for his knowledge of Soviet military capabilities and for his potential insights into Soviet society and psychology. The CIA established a safe house for Belenko in a Washington suburb, a standard middle-class American home requisitioned for intelligence purposes. To Belenko, it represented luxury beyond comprehension. The house had 3 bedrooms for a single person, 2 full bathrooms, a complete kitchen with refrigerator, stove, oven, and multiple appliances, central heating and air conditioning, hot water available unlimited at all times, a living room with television and furniture, a garage, a yard with grass. This was, the CIA officers explained, a typical middle-class American home. Nothing special or unusual, simply average housing for an ordinary American professional family. Belenko walked through the room slowly, trying to process what he was seeing. In the Soviet Union, his one-room apartment shared with 4 other families in a building with 1 bathroom and inconsistent utilities had been considered good housing for a military officer. This American middle-class house had more space, more amenities, and more comfort than housing available to all but the highest Soviet officials. The kitchen particularly stunned him. The refrigerator was larger than Soviet refrigerators available only to elite party members. It had a freezer compartment. The stove had 4 burners and an oven. There were multiple cabinets and storage areas. The counter space exceeded what Soviet kitchens, even in privileged housing, provided. The CIA officers showed Belenko how various appliances worked. The dishwasher, a machine that automatically washed dishes, the garbage disposal, a device that ground up food waste, the coffee maker that automatically brewed coffee. Each appliance represented technology that didn't exist in Soviet homes, not because Soviet engineering couldn't produce them, but because Soviet industrial capacity was consumed by military production and couldn't manufacture consumer goods in quantity or quality. But the CIA had planned something more significant. They understood that Soviet defectors often struggled with psychological shock when confronting Western abundance. They had learned from previous defections that gradual, controlled exposure worked better than sudden immersion. They decided to take Belenko to an American supermarket, but to prepare him first and document his reactions. On September 15, 1976, 9 days after his defection, CIA officers took Viktor Belenko to a Safeway supermarket in a Northern Virginia suburb. They chose a Wednesday afternoon, a time when the store would be busy enough to show normal operations, but not so crowded as to be overwhelming. They drove to the supermarket in a standard CIA sedan. During the drive, Belenko observed suburban Washington, neighborhoods of single-family homes, each with yards and garages, streets lined with parked cars, shopping centers with multiple stores, traffic lights that worked consistently. This was ordinary American suburban life, remarkable to Belenko precisely because it was unremarkable to Americans. The supermarket parking lot contained perhaps 200 automobiles. Private vehicles belonging to ordinary people shopping for groceries on a Wednesday afternoon. In the Soviet Union, the equivalent would be people arriving on foot, by bus, or perhaps bicycle, with maybe 2 or 3 cars belonging to party officials who had special access to state vehicles. The CIA officers later filed detailed reports on what happened next. Belenko stood at the entrance of the Safeway supermarket for nearly 3 minutes, apparently unable to process what he was seeing. The store was approximately 25,000 square feet, standard for American supermarkets of that era, nothing exceptional or unusual. To Viktor Belenko, it represented impossibility made real. The produce section displayed fruits and vegetables in quantities that exceeded anything he had imagined. Multiple varieties of apples, oranges, bananas, grapes, pears, peaches, lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, carrots, potatoes, onions, peppers, and produce he couldn't even identify. Fresh fruits and vegetables, displayed casually in September with no lines, no rationing, no limits on purchase quantity. Belenko approached a display of oranges slowly, almost reverently. In the Soviet Union, oranges were extremely rare, available perhaps once or twice a year in major cities if one had connections. When oranges appeared, lines formed immediately, people waiting hours for the chance to purchase 1 or 2 oranges per family. Here were hundreds of oranges, thousands of oranges across the produce section, piled high, available to anyone who wanted to buy them. He picked up an orange, examined it, felt its weight. Then he turned to his CIA handler and asked through the translator, "How much?" The handler checked the price sign. 79 cents per pound, maybe 3 or 4 oranges for $1. Belenko did mental calculations, trying to convert to rubles at both official and black market exchange rates. The price, in terms of percentage of average income, was far lower than Soviet prices for rare goods when they were available. But more significant than price was availability. These oranges were just here, available, unlimited, any day of the week. Anyone can buy these, as many as they want. Yes, there's no limit. Buy 1 orange or 100 oranges, whatever you need. Belenko later testified that this was the moment he truly understood that Soviet propaganda was not just exaggerated or misleading, but systematically, comprehensively inverted. The abundance in this ordinary supermarket on an ordinary day in an ordinary suburb exceeded anything available to Soviet citizens, except perhaps the highest party elite who shopped in special restricted stores. They walked through the aisles. The meat section displayed choices that seemed endless: beef, pork, chicken, turkey, lamb, fish, seafood, multiple cuts of each type, fresh and frozen, displayed in quantities that would require Soviet citizens to wait in lines for hours if available at all. In the Soviet Union, meat appeared in state stores perhaps once or twice weekly, and lines formed immediately with people purchasing whatever was available regardless of quality or type. The dairy section had milk, multiple types of cheese, yogurt, butter, cream, sour cream, ice cream, in dozens of flavors. In the Soviet Union, milk was rationed when available. Cheese was rare and typically of poor quality. Ice cream was a memory from childhood for most Soviet citizens. Here were entire freezer cases devoted to ice cream, 30 or 40 varieties, available unlimited. The canned goods aisles were particularly overwhelming. Hundreds of different products from dozens of different companies competing for consumer attention. Canned vegetables, fruits, soups, meats, fish, sauces, prepared meals. The variety alone exceeded the total number of products in most Soviet stores. One aisle contained only breakfast cereals. Belenko counted more than 50 different types of breakfast cereal from multiple companies in different sizes and flavors. The concept itself was alien. In the Soviet Union, breakfast was typically bread with butter if available. Perhaps kasha, porridge, maybe tea. The idea that an entire industry existed simply to provide variety in breakfast options, that consumers could choose from 50 different products for one meal component, represented economic abundance beyond Soviet comprehension. The frozen food section introduced a technology Belenko hadn't known existed at consumer scale. Multiple aisles of frozen meals, frozen vegetables, frozen fruits, frozen desserts, ice cream, frozen pizzas, frozen dinners. Americans, he realized, could purchase complete meals that required only heating. Meals with meat and vegetables and variety, available in dozens of options. His CIA handler noticed Belenko's hands shaking. "You okay? Need to sit down?" Belenko shook his head. This is normal store? For normal people? This is not special store for officials? Yes, this is just a regular supermarket. Nothing special. There are probably 50 stores like this just in this county. Hundreds in the Washington area, thousands across the country. Belenko walked down another aisle, this one containing cookies, crackers, chips, snacks, and confections. His mind was trying to calculate the implications. If this was a normal store and there were thousands like it, and Americans shopped here routinely without special permission or connections or ration cards, then everything he had been told was not just wrong, but completely inverted. The checkout area provided another revelation. Electronic cash registers that automatically calculated totals, a system that automated transaction processing. Baggers who packed purchases. The whole operation was efficient, fast, casual. People purchased food in quantities that would take Belenko's family weeks to consume, paid with currency or checks or credit cards, loaded their purchases into private automobiles, and drove away. Routine. Normal. Every day. Unremarkable. A woman ahead of them in line had a shopping cart filled with groceries. Belenko estimated the quantity would feed his family in the Soviet Union for a month or more. She paid with a check while chatting casually with the cashier about the weather. The whole transaction took perhaps 3 minutes. No ration cards, no identity documentation, no lines stretching for hours, no connections required, no party membership necessary. The register displayed the total, 94.37. Belenko's handler explained that this represented perhaps 10 to 12% of an average American worker's weekly salary. In the Soviet Union, equivalent food, if somehow available, would cost perhaps 300 rubles, representing nearly 2 months' salary for an average Soviet worker. They left the supermarket. Belenko sat in the car for several minutes, not speaking, apparently trying to process what he had witnessed. Finally, he spoke in halting English. Everything lies. Everything we are told is lies. Not exaggeration, not propaganda, lies, complete lies. The handler later reported that Belenko appeared shaken, almost traumatized by the supermarket visit. The abundance had not made him happy or excited. It had devastated him, because it meant that everything he had believed, everything he had been taught, everything he had defended and fought for was built on systematic falsehood. Over the following weeks, as CIA debriefings continued regarding the MiG-25 and Soviet military capabilities, Belenko requested to see more of normal American life. The CIA, recognizing the intelligence value of understanding how Soviet citizens would react to Western abundance, and wanting to ensure Belenko's cooperation and psychological stability, accommodated these requests. They took him to a shopping mall, Pentagon City in Arlington, Virginia. To Belenko, it was fantasy made real. Hundreds of stores, each selling specialized goods. Clothing stores with more garments than he had seen in his entire life. Electronics stores with televisions, radios, stereos, calculators. Bookstores with thousands of books on every subject, available to anyone who wanted to buy them without censorship or restriction. Toy stores with goods that Soviet children could never imagine. He watched American families shopping, parents with children, teenagers in groups, elderly couples. They walked casually through this abundance, occasionally purchasing items, often just browsing, window shopping. No one seemed amazed by what surrounded them. This was normal to them every day, unremarkable. One store particularly captured his attention. A sporting goods store displaying equipment for dozens of different sports and recreational activities. Camping gear, fishing equipment, hunting supplies, bicycles, exercise equipment, sports clothing, and shoes. The concept that ordinary people had leisure time and disposable income to pursue recreational activities was itself revealing. In the Soviet Union, leisure equipment was minimal and extremely difficult to obtain. But the most shocking observation was something more subtle. Belenko noticed that Americans in the mall didn't seem desperately happy in the way Soviet propaganda depicted capitalist consumers. They weren't frantically shopping for scarce necessities. They weren't fighting over limited goods. They were casually browsing, choosing from abundance, often deciding not to purchase simply because they didn't need or want particular items at that moment. This realization struck Belenko with particular force. In the Soviet Union, when goods appeared in stores, people purchased them immediately regardless of immediate need, because availability was uncertain. One bought shoes when shoes were available, whether one needed shoes immediately or not, because next week there might be no shoes. Americans could choose not to buy available goods because they knew those goods would still be available tomorrow, next week, next month. Abundance enabled actual choice, not just among products, but including the choice to buy nothing. At a record store, Belenko asked to see music selections. The variety was overwhelming. Thousands of albums from hundreds of artists in every musical genre: rock, pop, jazz, classical, country, folk, international music. Americans could choose from more music than Soviet citizens could imagine, and this was just one store in one mall in one city. The CIA also arranged for Belenko to visit an ordinary American home, not the safe house, but an actual family residence. They chose the home of one of the debriefing officers, a middle-level CIA analyst with a wife and 2 children, living in a suburban Maryland neighborhood on a government salary that was comfortable but not wealthy by American standards. The house was similar to the safe house: 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, full kitchen, living areas. But it was lived in, occupied by a real family filled with possessions that represented normal American middle-class life. The officer's wife gave Belenko a tour. The kitchen had a refrigerator freezer filled with food, more food than Belenko's family would see in months. multiple types of meat, vegetables, fruits, dairy products, beverages, condiments, frozen meals. The pantry contained canned goods, dry goods, cereals, snacks. We usually shop once a week, the wife explained through the translator. Sometimes I pick up a few things midweek if we run out of milk or bread, but mostly we do one big shopping trip on weekends. One shopping trip weekly, purchasing enough food for a family of 4 for an entire week. In the Soviet Union, shopping was a daily struggle, visiting multiple stores hoping to find available goods, standing in lines when something appeared, purchasing whatever was available rather than what was wanted. The children's rooms contained toys, books, games, sporting equipment, electronic devices. Each child had their own room, their own space, their own possessions. In the Soviet Union, families of 4 typically lived in 1 or 2 rooms total. The concept of children having individual bedrooms was nearly unimaginable. The garage contained the family's 2 automobiles plus bicycles, lawn maintenance equipment, tools, and sports gear. 2 cars, owned by a middle-level government employee and his wife who worked part-time as a nurse. In the Soviet Union, this family's equivalent would be lucky to have 1 bicycle. Belenko asked the translator to ask the officer how long he had waited to purchase his home. The officer looked confused by the question. Wait? I didn't wait. When we decided we wanted to move to a bigger house after our second child was born, I contacted a real estate agent. We looked at houses for a few weeks, found this one, got a mortgage from the bank, and moved in. The whole process took maybe 2 months. No waiting list, no party connections required, no special permissions, no bureaucratic approvals beyond standard mortgage processing. They decided they wanted a house, they found one, they bought it. The simplicity of the process was itself revolutionary to someone from the Soviet system. Throughout October and November 1976, Belenko's CIA debriefings continued. He provided detailed information about the MiG-25, about Soviet air defense systems, about training methods and capabilities. But he also provided something equally valuable: insights into how Soviet propaganda shaped perception and how Soviet citizens viewed the world. CIA psychologists noted that Belenko experienced what they termed reality shock, a psychological trauma resulting from discovering that one's fundamental understanding of the world is completely wrong. He had believed certain truths his entire life, truths that formed the foundation of his worldview. Those truths turned out to be systematic lies. The psychological impact was profound. Belenko reported difficulty sleeping, anxiety, feelings of betrayal, and anger. Not anger at America for being different than he was told, but anger at the Soviet system for lying so comprehensively. He had been willing to die defending what he thought was truth. He had been willing to sacrifice his wife and family for what he believed was necessary. And it had all been lies. In November 1976, the CIA arranged what would become the most famous moment of Belenko's defection: a carefully documented visit to a suburban Washington supermarket with photographers and intelligence analysts observing and recording his reactions. This was not his first supermarket visit, but it was the first systematically documented one. The CIA wanted detailed records of how a Soviet officer reacted to American consumer abundance, information that would prove useful for his psychological operations, and understanding Soviet propaganda effectiveness. The supermarket chosen was a giant food store in Vienna, Virginia, slightly larger than the first store he'd visited, but still a standard suburban supermarket. The visit was arranged for a Tuesday morning when the store would be relatively uncrowded. CIA analysts with cameras and recording equipment documented Belenko's reactions as he walked through different sections. The reports later filed provided extraordinary detail. In the produce section, Belenko spent 14 minutes examining different fruits and vegetables. He picked up items, examined them, asked questions about varieties and origins. When told that much of the fresh produce came from California, Florida, and Central America, transported by refrigerated truck and air freight to maintain freshness, he asked multiple questions about the logistics of such distribution. How is it economically possible to transport fresh food thousands of miles? He asked. In the Soviet Union, even local food distribution fails frequently. How can America move food from one coast to the other and still sell it at prices ordinary people can afford? The answer, the analysts explained, was the combination of efficient transportation infrastructure, refrigeration technology, competitive market systems, and agricultural productivity that made such logistics economically viable. The American transportation system could move goods more efficiently than Soviet systems could. American refrigeration technology could preserve food longer. American agricultural mechanization produced sufficient surplus to make long-distance shipping worthwhile, and American competitive markets drove efficiency improvements. Each element of this explanation represented a system failure in the Soviet Union. Transportation infrastructure was poor. Refrigeration technology lagged behind. Agricultural productivity was low. Central planning created inefficiencies rather than eliminating them. In the meat section, Belenko again displayed visible emotion. He stood in front of the display case for several minutes, apparently overwhelmed. The analyst noted that his hands were shaking. In the Soviet Union, Belenko said through the translator, meat is available in state stores perhaps once or twice per week if you are lucky. When it appears, lines form immediately. People purchase whatever is available, whatever quality, whatever type. They buy everything they can afford because they don't know when meat will be available again. Here, you have more meat in this one display case than I have seen in my entire life combined. And this is normal. This is Tuesday morning in an ordinary store. The dairy section provided another revelation. Belenko examined the ice cream freezer cases, which contained 37 varieties according to the analyst's count. He stood in front of the ice cream for nearly 5 minutes without speaking. Finally, he turned to the translator and said, "In the Soviet Union, ice cream was available when I was a child before I can remember clearly. My mother has told me about ice cream before the war and in the immediate post-war years, but I have never, in my adult life, been able to purchase ice cream. It simply isn't available. My wife has never tasted ice cream, and here you have 37 varieties, and Americans complain that their favorite flavor isn't in stock." The cereal aisle again overwhelmed him. The analyst counted 53 different breakfast cereal products from multiple companies. Belenko asked the translator to ask the store manager why so many different cereals were necessary. The manager, who had been briefed that he was showing the store to a foreign visitor but not told the visitor was a Soviet defector, looked confused by the question. Well, different people like different things. Kids want sugary cereals with cartoon characters. Adults want healthy options with less sugar. Some people want hot cereal, some want cold. Some want traditional oats, some want cornflakes. Some want rice cereals. The brands compete for customers by offering variety and quality. That's how the market works. The analyst noted that Belenko asked the translator to repeat this explanation twice, as if he was struggling to understand the concept of companies competing for customers through variety and quality rather than simply producing whatever the state planned, regardless of consumer preference. At the checkout, they arranged for Belenko to make a purchase. He selected items carefully: oranges, apples, a small steak, milk, bread, butter, cheese, a can of coffee, and after long consideration, a half-gallon container of chocolate ice cream. The total came to $23.87. The analyst noted that Belenko examined the receipt carefully, apparently calculating the cost in relation to income. Then he asked how long an average American worker would need to work to earn enough to purchase these groceries. The analyst calculated probably about 2.5 to 3 hours of work at average wage. Belenko nodded slowly. In the Soviet Union, these items, if somehow all available at once, which they never are, would cost perhaps 60, 70 rubles, representing nearly half a month's salary for an average worker. And most of these items are simply not available at any price. The ice cream purchase was particularly significant. Belenko later told CIA debriefers that buying ice cream, something he had never been able to do as a Soviet citizen, was symbolic for him. It represented abundance beyond necessity, luxury available to ordinary people, sweetness in life that the Soviet system couldn't provide. That evening, at the safe house, Belenko ate ice cream for the first time since childhood. The CIA officers present later reported that he consumed the entire half-gallon container over the course of the evening. repeatedly saying through the translator that he needed to ensure it was real, that it would still be there if he stopped eating it, that this wasn't a dream that would end. By December 1976, Belenko's intelligence debriefings were largely complete. He had provided extensive information about the MiG-25, which American engineers had been examining in detail in Japan, before returning it to the Soviet Union in disassembled form. The examination revealed that Western intelligence had dramatically overestimated the MiG-25's capabilities. The aircraft was fast but primitive, achieving performance through brute force rather than sophisticated technology. This discovery was strategically significant. NATO had designed defense systems and tactics based on inflated estimates of MiG-25 capability. Learning the truth allowed substantial adjustment and cost savings. The MiG-25's vacuum tube electronics, steel airframe, and crude design revealed that Soviet aerospace technology lagged significantly behind Western capabilities. But Belenko's greater contribution was his testimony about Soviet life, Soviet propaganda effectiveness, and how ordinary Soviet citizens understood the world. His detailed accounts of what Soviet citizens were told versus reality provided invaluable intelligence for psychological operations and policymaking. In December 1976, the CIA held extensive debriefing sessions specifically focused on Soviet propaganda and its effectiveness. Belenko provided detailed information about what Soviet citizens were taught regarding the West. Soviet citizens were taught that capitalism was failing economically with mass poverty and unemployment. American workers lived in desperate conditions while a tiny elite controlled all wealth. Most Americans couldn't afford adequate food, housing, or medical care. Crime and social decay made Western cities dangerous and unlivable. Racism pervaded American society, making it oppressive for non-white citizens. Western culture was shallow and decadent compared to Soviet culture. Soviet technology and science led the world. The Soviet system represented humanity's future while capitalism was dying. Belenko testified that intelligent Soviet citizens understood this was propaganda and exaggeration, but believed it was propaganda based on underlying truth. They thought the Soviet system exaggerated Western problems, but that the basic narrative was accurate. They assumed Western capitalism had significant problems even if not as extreme as Soviet propaganda claimed. What Belenko had discovered was that the propaganda wasn't exaggerated truth, it was inverted reality. The Soviet Union claimed to be leading the world while actually falling catastrophically behind. Soviet propaganda attributed to the West the very problems the Soviet Union actually suffered: shortages, poverty, technological backwardness, social control. The CIA analysts found this inversion particularly significant. It suggested that Soviet leadership either believed their own propaganda, making them dangerously disconnected from reality, or knew the truth but believed they could maintain control through systematic falsehood, making them cynical but potentially vulnerable to truth exposure. Throughout 1977 and 1978, Belenko continued working with American intelligence while beginning his new life as an American citizen. The CIA provided him with a new identity, financial support, and assistance adapting to American society. He worked as a consultant for various aerospace and intelligence organizations, providing expertise on Soviet systems and training methods. But his most significant role was as a witness. He gave extensive interviews to American journalists, though these were carefully controlled and edited to protect his identity and security. He spoke about his experience of defection, his discovery of Western abundance, and what it meant for an entire worldview to collapse. In a 1980 interview with Reader's Digest, Belenko provided one of his most quoted statements. "The first time I walked into an American supermarket, I saw more food in 5 minutes than I had seen in my entire life in the Soviet Union. Not food for elite party members, not special rations for military officers, but ordinary food available to ordinary people. At that moment, I knew that everything my government had told me was a lie. The Soviet Union was not leading the world into a glorious future. It was a failed state keeping its citizens in poverty while telling them that poverty was prosperity." The psychological impact of this discovery, Belenko testified, was profound and lasting. He experienced what psychologists might call cognitive dissonance at an extreme level. His entire understanding of reality had been wrong. The enemy he had been trained to fight was not weak and failing, but extraordinarily strong. The system he had been defending was not glorious, but oppressive. The sacrifices he had made were not noble, but pointless. This realization was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because he now lived in freedom and abundance. Devastating because he understood what he had lost: his wife, his family, his homeland, his identity. All sacrificed because his government had systematically lied to its citizens about basic reality. In 1980, Belenko published his autobiography, MiG Pilot, The Final Escape of Lieutenant Belenko, written with journalist John Barron. The book provided extensive detail about his life in the Soviet Union, his defection, and his discovery of American abundance. It became an international bestseller, particularly popular in Western countries, as validation of their system's superiority. But the book also served a strategic purpose. The CIA encouraged its publication and distribution, including smuggling copies into the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries. The book provided Soviet citizens with detailed testimony from one of their own about Western reality. It was far more credible than Western propaganda because it came from someone who had been just like them, who had believed what they believed, who had been taught what they were taught. Copies of Belenko's book circulated in samizdat form in the Soviet Union throughout the 1980s, passed hand to hand, copied and recopied, read secretly. Its impact on Soviet morale is difficult to quantify, but was likely significant. Here was a Soviet officer, not a Western propagandist, testifying that Western abundance was real and Soviet propaganda was comprehensive lies. By the mid-1980s, other sources of information were reaching Soviet citizens. Western radio broadcasts, smuggled publications, increased contact with foreigners as Gorbachev's policies allowed more openness. The testimony of defectors like Belenko contributed to growing awareness among Soviet citizens that their system was failing. In August 1991, Viktor Belenko watched on television as the Soviet Union collapsed, the failed hardline coup against Gorbachev, Yeltsin standing on a tank defending democracy, the rapid disintegration of Soviet authority. Within months, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, replaced by independent republics and a greatly diminished Russian Federation. Belenko later reflected on watching the collapse in interviews given after the Soviet Union's end made him less security critical. He noted the irony that the Soviet Union, which had seemed so powerful and permanent, had collapsed essentially without civil war. The system had simply exhausted itself, losing legitimacy when enough citizens understood the truth about its failures. In a 1992 interview, Belenko stated, "When I defected in 1976, the Soviet Union seemed permanent, powerful, eternal. But it was already hollow, already dying. The system was maintained by lies, and lies cannot sustain a nation indefinitely. Eventually, enough people see the truth, and when that happens, the system collapses not through revolution, but through exhaustion. People simply stop believing, stop pretending, and the entire structure falls apart." The story of Viktor Belenko's defection and his shock at American supermarket abundance became part of Cold War mythology, a symbol of the economic and social gulf between communist dictatorship and democratic capitalism. It represented a truth that the Cold War was won not primarily through military confrontation, though that played a role, but through the simple superiority of a system that could provide abundance to ordinary citizens. The Soviet Union allocated enormous resources to military production, achieving rough military parity with the United States, despite having an economy perhaps one-third the size. But this military parity came at the cost of consumer goods, infrastructure, living standards. Soviet citizens lived in perpetual shortage while their government built missiles and tanks to match American arsenals. Americans lived in abundance while also building sufficient military capability to deter Soviet aggression. The American system could do both, provide consumer prosperity and military security. The Soviet system couldn't. That imbalance, played out over decades, eventually broke the Soviet Union. Viktor Belenko lived in the United States for the rest of his life, becoming an American citizen, working in aerospace consulting, and living comfortably by American middle-class standards. He married an American woman in 1983 and had two children who grew up as ordinary Americans, attending public schools, going to college, living in a society where abundance was normal and supermarkets were unremarkable. He maintained security consciousness throughout his life, rarely granting interviews, keeping a low profile, aware that despite the Cold War's end, defectors were never completely safe from long memories and revenge. But he also maintained his conviction that his defection had been morally justified, that exposing Soviet lies had been necessary, that the truth he had helped reveal had contributed, however slightly, to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. In his last interview before his death in 2023, Belenko reflected on the significance of his experience. When I think about my defection, I don't primarily remember the danger or the fear or the flight across the Sea of Japan. I remember standing in that first supermarket seeing ordinary abundance and understanding that my entire life until that moment had been based on lies. That moment of realization, devastating as it was also liberating. I understood that truth was possible, that the world didn't have to be the way Soviet propaganda claimed, that ordinary people could live with dignity and prosperity. That understanding was worth everything I lost. And eventually, enough Soviet citizens reached similar understanding and the lies could no longer sustain the system. Viktor Belenko's defection represented one of thousands of individual choices that collectively undermined the Soviet system. Each defector, each dissident, each person who stopped believing Soviet propaganda contributed to the erosion of legitimacy that eventually brought down the USSR. But Belenko's story was particularly powerful because it crystallized a simple truth. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War not on battlefields, but in supermarkets. Not through military defeat, but through the contrast between abundance and scarcity, between truth and lies. The statistics of Soviet-American comparison by 1976, when Belenko defected, told a clear story. Per capita, GDP, United States, $18,500, Soviet Union, $6,200, approximately 33% of U.S. Automobile ownership, United States, 528 vehicles per 1,000 people. Soviet Union, 11 vehicles per 1,000 people. Consumer goods availability, United States, abundant with competitive variety. Soviet Union, chronic shortages of basic goods. Housing, United States, average 1.8 people per room. Soviet Union, average 4.2 people per room. Food consumption, United States, 3,400 calories per capita daily. Soviet Union, 2,800 calories per capita daily, with limited variety. Consumer electronics. United States, 95% of households had television, 85% had refrigerators. Soviet Union, 45% of households had television, 15% had refrigerators. These numbers, dry statistics, translated into lived experience. Americans lived in abundance as their normal condition. Soviet citizens lived in scarcity despite being told they inhabited a worker's paradise. This gap between propaganda and reality, between promise and delivery, eventually destroyed the Soviet system's legitimacy. Viktor Belenko's defection and his testimony about discovering American abundance contributed to that process of delegitimization. His story spread through official and unofficial channels, reaching people behind the Iron Curtain, providing evidence that Western accounts of prosperity were not propaganda but truth. Each person who learned the truth became slightly less loyal to the Soviet system, slightly more aware that they had been deceived. The Cold War ended not with nuclear exchange or military conquest, but with system failure. The Soviet Union collapsed because it couldn't compete economically, couldn't provide for its citizens, couldn't maintain legitimacy once enough people understood the truth. Viktor Belenko, walking into an American supermarket in 1976 and realizing his government had lied to him his entire life, experienced personally what would eventually happen collectively to the entire Soviet system. The abundance he discovered was not just material, but philosophical. America offered not just more consumer goods, but more freedom. Freedom to choose, freedom to speak, freedom to question, freedom to leave. These freedoms, as much as the full supermarket shelves, represented what the Soviet system couldn't provide and couldn't compete against. In the end, Viktor Belenko's story is not primarily about military technology or intelligence coups, though his defection with the MiG-25 provided valuable intelligence. His story is about truth versus lies, abundance versus scarcity, freedom versus control. It's about what happens when someone raised on comprehensive propaganda encounters reality and has the courage to accept what that reality means. He flew across the Sea of Japan to escape a lie. What he found in America was not perfect, not utopian, not without problems. But it was true. The supermarkets were real, the abundance was real, the freedom was real. And that truth, simple and undeniable, was worth everything he had sacrificed to find it.